Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, May 11th, 2022. My name is Drew Clark. I'm the editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Very happy to welcome our guest here to talk about a very interesting and important topic, namely Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter and what this will mean for social media, free speech, Section 230, and other issues of very significant importance in our digital town square, right? What we talk about. And just to back up a second and say a few words about Broadband Breakfast and our Broadband Breakfast Live Online series. We've been doing this for more than 2 years since the start of the pandemic. We've been meeting every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time, and we focus on issues from broadband infrastructure, fiber and wireless, to broadband's impact, the role it plays in our society, and big tech and the issues surrounding big tech, from social media to antitrust, free speech, Section 230, et cetera. So when we learned that Elon Musk, first was teasing with this acquisition of a big chunk, a 10% chunk, and then, I'll join the board. Oh, no, I won't join the board. Oh, I'll take it over. I mean, it was kind of been like this business pages soap opera that we've been following. And last week, I believe, or 10 days ago, it was just finally announced that the deal is done, or at least the shares are there. I'm sure there's some closing to take place, but in any case, this is very significant news, and we're going to try to understand a little bit more about it, what it means, what the debate about Musk's acquisition of Twitter will mean, not just for Twitter itself, but for the social media debate as it's taking shape here in Washington. And so for that purpose, we are very excited to welcome our guest for today's discussion. Her name is Amy Peikoff, and she's the Chief Policy Officer from Parlor. But just give me one more minute, Amy, before we kind of turn to you to give us some of your thoughts and take on this topic. I want to say that, as I've just laid out, we care about the infrastructure and the impact and the way it's used. That is to say, broadband, high-speed internet is used. And we're going to be talking about some very exciting topics in the weeks to come. Next week, we haven't updated our main page yet. Next week, we're very excited to announce that we're going to have Joe Wender, the head of the U.S. Treasury Department's Capital Projects Fund, which is a area of broadband funding. He will be our guest for Broadband Breakfast Live Online next Wednesday, May 18th, just kind of on the cusp of the announcement of the Commerce Department's broadband funding notice. So those are deep in the weeds infrastructure questions, and much of our audience is concerned about that, and much of our audience is also concerned about the issues of impact and big tech, which we're going to be talking about here today. The final shout I just want to do before turning it over to Amy and the discussion du jour is to thank the sponsors of Broadband Breakfast. We would not be able to do these weekly events without their support. They include Utopia Fiber, Broadband.money, Broadband Now, Powerhouse Management, Lightbox, Ookla, Samsung, Positron Access, Connect the Future, and the California Emerging Technology Fund, as well as our sponsors for our recent digital infrastructure investment event, Sci-Fi Networks and Pinpoint Capital Advisors. So thank you to our sponsors for that support. Let's go now to Amy. Amy, you are the Chief Policy Officer at Parlor. And of course, Parlor is a social network that seems to have a view about politics and the world. Would you take a few minutes to tell us a little bit about Parlor, who it is, and your background, Amy, and what led you to work at Parlor?
Sure, Drew. Thanks for having me on. So Parlor, for people who don't know, is a social media platform. We are nonpartisan And we do offer essentially the sort of content moderation policies that we see Elon Musk sort of sketching out, at least in broad brushstrokes, over the tweets and things that we've seen released, when we've learned what he plans to do when he acquires Twitter. Parler's been around since 2018. I joined Parlor in July of 2020, so almost 2 years ago. And so, of course, I was with Parlor all the way through the increase in traffic that we got through the 2020 election. And also, you may have been aware of the fact that when Donald Trump was banned from Twitter, there was a rumor that he was going to be coming over to Parlor. And so, as you can imagine, we were gaining millions of new account signups in that week following the 6th of January, which we can discuss if you want as well.
Yes.
There's a lot of controversy about supposedly, Parlor in particular, but social media in general being involved around the 6th of January. But at that point, there were some big tech companies that you might know of: Amazon, Google, Apple, who decided that they wanted to deplatform us right after we were, gaining all of these new followers. We were #1 on the app stores, the most downloaded app in our category, et cetera, and just taken completely offline by Amazon, who had provided the cloud services for us at that time. As for me and my background, I was an academic before, so I've got a JD PhD. My PhD was in the right to privacy. I have been very concerned with all of the issues overall. What I would say, and I hope that most of us can agree, is that I would like to prevent George Orwell's 1984 from becoming our reality, right? And I've been, quoted, I've said this many times out there. I believe that 1984 is a dystopian novel, not an instruction manual. And yet all the time, everywhere we turn, we see it, being turned that way. Parler's dual mission at its inception was around providing a free speech platform, again, along the kind of broad brushstroke lines that Musk is detailing, although I have a couple quibbles with some of his formulations, and we could talk about that. But the other thing, of course, is privacy. And so from my perspective, I had been concerned in particular with Facebook's invasion of user privacy, but even more so, I was concerned with the remedies that the FTC wanted to impose in reaction to Facebook's violations of user privacy, alleged or true or otherwise. And in particular, I had written an amicus brief about the consent order, the most recent one that was rubber stamped in April of 2020. The case was United States versus Facebook, not an interesting title. But I had written an amicus brief in which I laid out my concerns with respect to the FTC and the DOJ getting warrantless access to Facebook user data under that consent order. Of course, nobody was paying attention because we were all absorbed in the pandemic. And that is the consent order that governs the relationship between government and Facebook today. And to me, that's concerning. And my concern is that I would not like to see more of this sort of entanglement between government and big tech platforms going forward again, because I don't want Orwell's 1984 to become a reality. So that's my sort of approach. But then from there, we can go on in a variety of directions.
Wonderful. And again, thanks for laying out some issues that we're going to want to come back to, including the government interaction with the big tech platforms. So, we haven't really mentioned Section 230 yet, but let's go right to the January 6th episode, because that's really where Parler got a lot of attention, a lot of headlines, and the deep platforming. Okay, so first of all, what exactly is, I guess I sometimes call it deep platforming, but it's deplatforming. Could you speak to what is deplatforming in kind of common parlance? And was that what Parler was hit with, or was it, actual disconnections of your cloud services and the like? So just walk us through a little bit about that episode and what you did to rectify it, if indeed it has been rectified.
Sure. So deplatforming, as a broader concept, you could say, is that a service provider is withdrawing a service that she, the company has agreed to provide you with. And of course, the service involves providing you a platform for speech of some kind. So we speak all the time about individuals being deplatformed by, for example, Twitter or Facebook. But you can also talk about an entire social media platform being deplatformed by the service providers that make it possible for it to be online and to offer, in turn, a platform for its users. And that's how we, speak of what happened to Parlor. We definitely believe we were unjustly deplatformed on that weekend of January 8th through 10th by, again, Amazon, Apple, Google.
So are you back? I mean, what happened?
Oh yeah, no, we've been back for some time, but what we've been having to do, of course, first we rebuilt the whole stack that would get us online. And then we've also rebuilt much of the old code base, although we brought in some kind of legacy elements that we're in the process of tweaking and getting some improvement on. But we are continuously improving the quality and the stability of the platform, the ability to scale. And we have been up on the Apple App Store, the iOS apps for quite a long time. So you can get our on Apple now. Soon we'll be up on Google Play again. We do have a sideload Android version that's available, but we've been on for quite some time. Obviously, recently the attention has been more on Twitter, and we're using that to go ahead and build some features in, and then pretty soon we're going to be making a push to try to get people to come over and see what a true free speech platform actually operates like in practice. But with the 6, if you want to talk a little bit about the 6, so the controversy was that supposedly Parlor was a place where we were providing a platform for the planning of a violent insurrection against the Capitol. And since the time that we were deplatformed and all of this noise was made, there have been stories in which they documented the fact that the content at issue, this violent or inciting content, was not just on Parlor, it was all over the place. And if anything, it was more on Facebook, particularly in Facebook groups, where any meaningful coordination could take place with respect to making these plans. But this content was everywhere. And the other thing that was revealed in the weeks following the deplatforming, maybe the months after, I forget the exact timing, but there was a congressional committee that did an investigation, and Parlor shared with that committee the fact that we had referred dozens of examples of violent and inciting content posted publicly on the Parlor platform, referred these to law enforcement in the weeks leading up to January 6th. Apparently, Facebook had also done some of this referrals. And recently, if you go ahead and Google or DuckDuckGo or whatever your preferred search engine is, you'll find there's been a news story talking about the fact, actually, I think it was MSNBC that did a feature on the fact that an investigation showed that these referrals that were sent, again, by both Facebook and Parlor, those are the only two that were mentioned, maybe others did too, but those two were mentioned, that they ignored it. They ignored the warnings that we were given and did not adequately prepare for what happened that day. So, given all of this, we think that Parlor was definitely unjustly treated and scapegoated by all of that. And, again, we don't have the engagement enhancing algorithms. A lot of the times when they've talked about supposedly you had, accounts from Eastern Europe or from Russia that were trying to spread misinformation and stuff, these accounts just don't get engagement because we have a chronological feed and et cetera. So, again, I think we have been, grossly scapegoated and misrepresented over at Parlor.
So has Parlor filed suit against anyone for these matters?
There's an ongoing litigation against Amazon. And so, of course, therefore, I can't say very much about it, except for the sort of things that I've already said.
Right. Well, let's talk just a tad more about deplatforming. Okay. And so obviously the most prominent example is the former president of the United States, right? He is still to this day banned from Twitter, I believe Facebook, I don't know if he's on Parlor, right? I mean, he's obviously seems to be promoting his own social network, Truth Social, as I understand. But like, how big a problem have you or anyone you know, Amy, made an effort to quantify the deplatforming challenge? Like, how big is the problem of how many people that we know of who have been kind of like pushed off, banned from Twitter, Facebook, et cetera, YouTube?
I mean, people are also banned from LinkedIn, right? Or they're restricted. So I know of people that were supposedly spreading COVID misinformation on LinkedIn. And so then their accounts were locked and they were told that they would have to show special forms of ID or something in order to get back on. So this is all these different platforms have these issues. But yeah, the group of doctors who question the official wisdom that has been, coming down from, Anthony Fauci and the NIH and the CDC or the FDA. Anybody who asks the wrong questions even can get banned from these social media platforms. So I think it's a rather large problem, but I don't have an exact quantity, obviously.
Mm-hmm. So do you have any further insight into former President Trump's plans with regard to social media? He's not active on Parlor, right?
No, he's never been active on Parlor. As I said, he was rumored to be coming over to Parlor that week. And then of course it never happened. He may have come over at that time. You might say that the fact that we were deplatformed is what made him think he needs to create his own Truth Social, but certainly he's interested in promoting that right now. It's an interesting speculation now that Elon Musk has said that if this acquisition goes through, he's going to reinstate the former president's account. Is he going to actually go over there to Twitter, or is he going to do exactly what he said, which is he's going to stay over at Truth and stay away from Twitter? It's, we could make some bets, I guess, right?
Well, okay, so let's talk a little bit about Elon Musk and what we know about his tweeting habits, right? Obviously, I was a follower before I knew it was like wrong to follow Elon Musk on Twitter, and there's a lot of interesting. He's like one of these people who gets it, who uses humor in the way that travels on social media. What's your take on what he's trying to do in his acquisition of Twitter, and what kind of I don't know, threat or vindication? How do you at Parlor view what's happened with Elon Musk saying, I'm going to buy it. I'm going to buy it and make it a free speech social media?
I mean, the biggest thing, of course, is that it's proof of concept for Parlor, right? Because Parlor identified a need, right? The founders of Parlor identified a need that there needed to be a free speech alternative to these platforms that were already a few years ago becoming censorious. And so, to see the fact that he also sees that need, of course, with the resources at his disposal, his solution would not be create a different platform, but go ahead, now that the price seems to be right, as far as we can tell, go ahead and purchase this one that he has been a participant in, that he seems to love, et cetera. And he's going to try to make it into that free speech platform that perhaps it once was and that he thinks it should be again. Obviously, I would agree with his motivation, and he seems to be very earnest in it. We had talked before, Drew, about, was I a critic of any kind? The only thing I will do is I'll nitpick on formulations here and there, again, because I'm a JD PhD and I've been in this game for a while. And I am concerned where if you have imprecise formulations or imprecise ways of implementing policies, that you will perhaps create future problems down the road that'll end up eroding free speech once again, even with the best intentions. So
again, this is really wonderful. There's a lot of issues we want to talk about: state action, Section 230, platform, and whether it's a united thing or a unit, like a utility-like thing. But let me start, and I'm glad to know you're a law professor, or you've done teaching law, and so let's go to the First Amendment. And obviously the First Amendment reads, Congress shall pass no law restricting the freedom and then all of the freedoms, not just speech, but assembly, religion, free exercise of religion, et cetera. Mm-hmm. The First Amendment is a negative right, as we say in philosophy. It's a right not, for the government not to impinge. It's not a positive right. It's not a right to free speech. It's a right against the government. So two questions I have for you is, what First Amendment rights do speakers have on Twitter and other platforms? And let me pair that with, what First Amendment rights do platforms like Twitter and Parlor have kind of against those who would want to push them to do things or not do things? So let's just take those two questions in tandem, Amy.
Sure. So politically, of course, legally, your rights are only against the government. So theoretically, you can have a platform in which there's all sorts of arbitrary restrictions on what you can say or not. It could be the most arcane, difficult to read terms of service, very restrictive. You can't talk about pineapple pizza on Tuesdays or whatever. I mean, it could be just crazy. And the users would have no right to object, right? Because again, this is a right against the government. Now, normatively, ethically, then there's a different story. So if you're going to have a platform, and if it's going to be a social media platform that doesn't have, say, a specialized purpose, for example, there are all these little special interest discussion forums for BMW lovers or whatever, right? If it's not something like that, if you're just wanting to provide a platform more broadly, then you can say normatively, and we see that Elon Musk, I think, agrees with me here. Normatively, it is best to allow as much speech as possible. Why? So that you are fostering the idea of people having productive civil discourse and thinking for themselves about important issues of the day, and actually trying to, sort of duplicate online what might have happened in coffee houses or taverns in the history of our country and of the world, so that people could talk about issues that were important to them and exchange information, and et cetera. I think free and open discussion with as few restrictions as possible, is the normative way to go, the best normative way to go. So there's sort of what is normatively right, and then there's what is your legal and political right, and those are two different things.
Okay, so what I've begun to notice is more and more people are thinking that you have a First Amendment right to say something on a platform, right? I mean, like maybe 10, 20 years ago, people didn't think that way. They just thought, well, yeah, of course, a newspaper has the freedom to publish or not publish what it wants. Obviously, broadcasting was a separate case. We don't need to go into that, although I've written about that and why the broadcasting doesn't have the First Amendment rights that print and internet media do. But I mean, do you think that's a kind of a fallacy that's becoming ingrained in the popular consciousness, or do you think, like you just said, it's just a normative reflection of the fact that people want to have a free speech world, and therefore these terms of service restrictions are becoming more and more onerous?
I mean, I think people are starting to see the consequences of a policy that deviates from a First Amendment based policy, right? So, for example, if you talk about what was considered misinformation with respect to COVID and the vaccines a couple of years ago, 1 year ago, versus today, the sort of things that we get you deplatformed a year ago are now known to be true. That, for example, you can spread the coronavirus if you have been vaccinated. You can catch the coronavirus multiple times if you've been vaccinated and boosted multiple times. These are things that we now know to be true that were once deemed misinformation, could get you deplatformed. It's just one example of the idea that these sort of restrictions, banning, fact checking, and things, they hinder the spread of knowledge that could be very important for human beings to know. You don't want to walk around with a false sense of security about whether you are vulnerable to the coronavirus, right? For example, so that I think people are normatively realizing the importance of this. And then I think also, especially when you start to see things like Jen Psaki getting up and talking about the fact that The Biden administration has flagged certain bits of so-called misinformation for Facebook or other social media platforms. If you have the Department of Homeland Security explicitly starting to go after misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, you have the Surgeon General putting out announcements that he's going to be requesting from social media platforms information about the proliferation of disinformation on the platforms. All of this rhetoric, at least I think, probably brings home to a lot of people implicitly, if not explicitly, the importance of maintaining full and free expression online. And so, again, I think a lot of this understanding came home to Elon Musk, maybe in part because of the Babylon Bee banning on Twitter. I think that was a pivotal moment in his consciousness. And then suddenly, there's enough support and demand for this, even though some people are not very excited about it. We've seen some critics as well, but there's enough support and demand for this such that he is most likely going to be able to pull off this acquisition, and he's going to push Twitter in a more positive direction with respect to freedom of expression. I think that is a huge win, a huge development. Of course, I'd like to see it succeed in the best way possible, for the spirit of expression, even if they're a competitor, right?
Yeah. Well, could you just lay out the Babylon Bee episode that because not all of our listeners may know this. And by the way, we reached out to and had some expressions of interest by Seth Dillon, the CEO, being on this program. We just weren't able to accommodate time-wise, but because I have watched that, because I do agree that this is a really scary thing. I'm wondering if you could just articulate what happened there a little bit more.
Sure. So as I understand it, it's Rachel Levine, right? Is the bureaucrat, was named Woman of the Year. And of course, some people who consider themselves politically conservative will say that they don't believe that Rachel Levine is really a woman. And Babylon Bee is in the business of making all sorts of jokes, tasteless or otherwise, about points, cultural points like this all the time. They make fun of religious people. They make fun of everything, really. But in this case, they went ahead and put a tweet out talking about the fact that they had nominated Rachel Levine Man of the Year. And that, of course, ended up running afoul of Twitter's policies. And as I understand, it would be targeting some sort of protected group, a protected minority of some kind. And so therefore the account was frozen. They were, told that they must remove this tweet, otherwise their account would continue to remain frozen, et cetera. The concern, right, about this, you could say, okay,
clearly a platform taking a political stance that you cannot say this, that doesn't appear, it doesn't even appear to be like in the misinformation or like fighting words, none of those previous doctrines.
It is taking a stand on a particular issue that has ethical and scientific and all sorts of different things that come to play in it, right? Which is, is it right to say that a trans woman is a woman? Would it be culturally positive to nominate such a person as Woman of the Year, et cetera? There's a number of issues that are kind of bound up in this one particular application of Twitter's policy. But Twitter's policy more broadly, they would say that it's a broad principle that they try to avoid targeting or harassing of people who belong to protected groups because of the membership in that group. That's the way that I would articulate it. Their exact wording is different. So sorry if I made any errors there, but I think that pretty well describes it. But the concern with this one is that you're talking about a government official. So it's not like you're having, criticism of some poor individual and you're really, beating up on her and et cetera. This is a government official. And if you cannot in United States, and I think in any country of the world, you should be able to do this, but United States, we have a more robust tradition of free expression than anywhere in the world is currently honoring, unfortunately. If you can't criticize government officials here and you can't do it in a humorous way with satire, where are we? Where are we? What does the future look like? That's one of the big concerns.
So we have a question from one of our audience members. You feel free to send your questions either publicly or privately. This one was sent privately. Many make the argument that Twitter functions as a virtual public square, and thus Twitter should not be able to moderate or censor speech, but public squares are just that, public. How do you respond to the argument that as a private company, Twitter should not be obligated to lend anyone and everyone their microphone if they find speech objectionable? Okay, so this is going right to, and I'll have a follow-up on public action, but that pure question, how do you respond to that, Amy?
Yeah, so I would say, of course, that Twitter would have the legal right to do any of these things as a private company. The concern that, again, I think a lot of people feel is that increasingly those decisions aren't being made by private companies as private companies. And this is where the so-called state action theory comes in. This is a legal theory that was first, as far as I know, popularized by Vivek Ramaswamy and Judd Rubenfeld in January of 2021 in a Wall Street Journal piece that was really excellently written. And this theory is now starting to be applied in various lawsuits, not with very much success that I've seen so far as I can tell. I think the Donald Trump suit was dismissed, and it was based at least in part on this theory. But the theory is that when you have these private companies, they're putatively private companies, but they are given broad immunity for engaging in a certain type of conduct. They have government officials presenting various carrots and sticks to encourage the companies to exercise that broad immunity in the way that the government officials would want. And they're doing it in a way that government officials couldn't do if they were trying to do it directly, i.e., government officials cannot censor in our country. Then this theory says it's valid to go ahead and use a state action theory, say that in effect, the Twitter officials, employees who have made these decisions to remove this content effectively in order to cooperate with government, that they are guilty of First Amendment violations just as much as a government official would be.
So you've leaned into the next question. Indeed, it's literally the next question from our audience here, which is that special immunity, of course, is Section 230 of the Communications Act that came to be in 1996. There's really two provisions at play in this. We'll focus mostly on the speech issue here, and it's an immunity for basically comments on social networks, right? So Twitter is not liable for a comment made on Twitter because it has facilitated that, right? And so Dan Smith in the questions here asks, in my opinion, the Europeans are on the right track on social media regulations. Why should social media who look at and monetize content with ads be protected by Section 230? Your reaction, Amy?
So the principle behind Section 230 is, I believe, a correct principle. And it is that if you are a platform, there is such thing as a platform that just provides this forum for users to post, to generate content. And so the platform should not be treated as a publisher with respect to content that it did not create. Now, at the same time, I am, and this is the thing, there is a problem with Section 230 right now. Right now, a lot of people are concerned that there's too much censorship online, and they're looking for Section 230 to do it. On the other hand, you've got Democrats like Barack Obama calling for an amendment to Section 230 that would, in fact, provide more control over speech, more reasons that speech should be excluded from social media platforms. Where I tend to go with this is to follow Justice Clarence Thomas, but not as far as to say that these platforms are common carriers. Okay, they're private companies. They should be able to make the decisions that they want. Normatively, of course, I think it should be a free speech policy guided by the First Amendment, as we do on Parlor. I think that's what it should be. But what Clarence Thomas is talking about in his, first of all, he had a statement 2 years ago, Malwarebytes versus Enigma. That was the first case. And then there was another case this year, Jane Doe versus Facebook. In both of the statements and with respect to these cases, he talked about the fact that Section 230 has been interpreted too broadly. And so that the immunity it provides the platform has been actually construed too broadly. It does not hold the platforms accountable for their contributions to either the content of the speech, the way that it's presented on the platform, the reach that it might enjoy due to algorithmic manipulation, right? There's a number of ways in which a platform, acting as a platform, will nonetheless contribute to either the content or the presentation or the reach of speech. And Clarence Thomas is urging that the platforms just simply be held potentially liable for their contribution. And I think that's right. So, I don't know that you would take Section 230 away entirely. There is a question in the law, Drew, that you and I are familiar with, which is, when does a procedural advantage like a rule embedded in a Section 230, when does that become sort of a substantive advantage to the point where it's unjust? Before Section 230 existed, this principle of immunity for user-generated content did exist in case law. This could have been solved as as common law. And instead, Congress chose to embed it in Section 230. The principle is right. It should not go anywhere. When congressmen, they sit there and they say, oh, Facebook, you better do what we want. Otherwise, we're going to,
Right.
repeal Section 230. I don't think that is right at all, because this is a normatively correct principle. The question is whether it should be embedded in a statute.
So I'm hearing a kind of a nuanced defense of Section 230. Maybe it's been interpreted too far or too broadly, but you defend it as opposed to the repeal Section 230 tweet that we saw from Donald Trump.
Yeah, there's that error. It might be that repeal politically would be the best option if what's going to come as a result of congressional action is going to result in more entanglement between tech and government, again, moving us closer to that Orwellian universe.
To the 1984. And I want to go to that because I happened to watch an event at the Heritage Institute last week where there was a kind of a debate about this Section 230. And Susan Myers asks for a link to the state action theory. After this event, I will post the link to the Wall Street Journal article you've referenced, Amy, on the page for this event. So just go.
I might be able to grab it while we're sitting.
Oh, well, wonderful. All the better if you can multitask that level. But the argument seems to be that, maybe it's a stronger argument when there's a Democrat in the White House, because you can point to, Jen Psaki's statements that, oh, if you don't do this, then we're going to take away Section 230 or other types of entanglements. But could you just articulate a little bit more why exactly? I'm not convinced yet. Maybe there's something here I just haven't absorbed yet. But really, are you saying that the extent to which the government grants on an even-handed basis immunity, that is a state action of a speech nature? Do you agree with that, Amy?
Well, so the mere granting of the legal immunity itself would not qualify. So there's the three prongs. So you've got to have the legal immunity, and then you have to have government officials, bureaucrats, et cetera, nudging the platforms to take actions while they enjoy that immunity, of course, to take actions that serve the government's purposes. And of course, actions that the government could not do if it tried to do it directly. Our government under the First Amendment is not permitted, at least at this point. We're seeing the DHS with their disinformation board or whatever. They're going to try, but it's going to be challenged. At this point right now, we have a First Amendment that protects us from government interfering in what sort of speech that can be online. And yet there's many of us who believe that at least in some cases, the removal of content from these big platforms has been done not exactly on an order of government, because there's no explicit legal authority yet, but that they are willing to, these platforms are willing to go along with the wishes of government and affect censorship by proxy, maybe, in order to get certain favors. Antitrust is another thing that they've been threatened with. So it's not just the repeal of Section 230. There's antitrust action that's been thrown at them too, and a number of other things probably that we don't even know about that hit them daily.
Well, the antitrust was clearly a feature of the Trump presidency, right? And the whole discussion of the AT&T's Time Warner acquisition. So I want to just maybe one last question on this point about state action, and I want to address. To me, it seems the most suspicious when a particular person is deplatformed from multiple platforms all at the same time, right? From Facebook, from Twitter, from YouTube. That's the scariest, right? But if we see a modulation, if Twitter and Google were at least somewhat different in who they deplatformed and when, then it'd seem like more like a market where different platforms are taking actions and the market can choose which platform. What are your thoughts on that? And again, have you looked at that at all? Have you,
we experienced it, right? We experienced it within a couple days. We have seen, that was what the experience of Parlor, like I said, it was the weekend of the 8th to the 12th of January, 2021. And it was a coordinated action, it seemed. Whether it actually was coordinated, who knows, but it was within days of each other. And the letters that we received were within hours of each other from Apple and Amazon.
Mm-hmm. So what can be done about that, Amy? Like, is this just a problem of tech too powerful?
Exactly. So there's a problem. And so then the question is, government does need to do something, but what is the proper solution? And many people are talking about, you're going to go ahead and deem them common carriers. You're going to use antitrust in various ways. You're going to amend Section 230. You're going to repeal Section 230. What is it that we should do? I think the very best thing we can do, given that there probably is this entanglement between government and big tech, is the vehicle of private lawsuits to figure out in a particular case of deplatforming, of removing content online, you have to have discovery. You have to allow the fact finders to actually see what went on in a particular case and hold the platforms and the government bureaucrats involved accountable for this, because we don't want it to happen again. My concern, if you amend, you have a common carrier designation, all of these things, we'd have to look at the particular. But the principle is that any further legislation in this area can be used to create further pressure on the platforms by government to allow or remove content according to their wishes. So any tool that you're thinking that you want to put in the hands of government to solve this problem, you have to think of that tool in the hand of your craftiest political opponent. Mm-hmm. And, at least do that mental exercise. But I think more broadly, again, you have to talk about leaving human beings free to think for themselves, to express themselves, to share information, to try to solve the problems that we need to solve if we're going to have that bright future that Elon Musk and all of us are trying to look forward to.
Let's broaden out to this very big question of social media and its role, its mental health role, right? I mean, so in monetary policy, there's a law, Gresham's law. I'm sure you've heard of it, Amy, like bad money drives out good. So when there's an inflated currency, or there's, if there's competing currencies, bad law drives out good. Bad money drives out good money. And kind of maybe the facetious analogy is Godwin's law, after my friend Mike Godwin, who basically said, like, on the internet, there's like the probability that a discussion will evolve towards someone calling the other person Hitler, veers towards 1. Okay, so these are kind of two things out there about, like, we know bad things prevail over good things, and yet kind of we still sometimes talk in this, John Stuart Mill-esque, free exchange of ideas, and the good ideas will always prevail. And sure, as a person of the Enlightenment, I think that's in the end the right strategy. And yet the last 5-10 years have really done a whammy to that because of all of the ways in which it seems that social media has contributed to division, polarization, lack of a common factual understanding. You work in the midst of a social media platform, so you are thinking about this, I presume, a lot. What is your take on whether the good themes, discussions drive out the bad ones, and what are some of the technological tools behind the scenes that could help accelerate that good driving out bad?
Well, so in terms of a culprit, I really highly suspect that it's engagement enhancing algorithms that are to blame for a lot of the bad that we have seen online. And, so for example, if you say, okay, there's these engagement enhancing algorithms on Facebook and Twitter that are geared towards showing people content that they are more likely to engage with. Unfortunately, I would say also, our news media conspires to make people more motivated and primed for fear than maybe they are for things that are more positive. So you could talk about that duality of motivation by love versus motivation by fear. Marketing forever has been pushing us to be more motivated by fear. So I think the combination of that and the engagement enhancing algorithms on social media has created this horrible perfect storm where all of the content that is, sort of getting the most hateful reactions and stuff, that's the stuff that is proliferated the most. There is an inherent element to discussions online, which is that, you're behind a keyboard, the other person's behind the keyboard. And so there's less restraint. I mean, even if you're on the, freeway or something, you're driving in a car, if you knew you were going to talk to the person face to face, but you were unhappy with their driving, you might phrase it differently than if you think they can't hear you and you're just right. So anything that creates that distance where you feel like you can say something that you wouldn't say to their face, that's an inherent problem with this. But it is a matter of learning. I think human beings are capable of learning. And if you had a platform that is free of engagement enhancing algorithms, and at the same time you provide a robust set of tools that individual users can use to curate their feed. Sorry, I had this cat this whole time.
Cats on the internet. What can you say?
She's always here when I'm having meetings. So anyway, if you have the tools, so for instance, the mutant block features, of course, are standard. What we do on Parlor is we treat what many people call a hate speech filter. We call it our trolling filter because I like to be precise about what this content is. This content is attacks on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation, sexual identity, religion. Those attacks, what many people call hate speech, really don't contribute anything productive to discourse. Ideally, what you would do, normatively, what I think is right to do is put that tool into the hands of individual users to decide whether they want to filter that content completely from their feeds. Maybe they want what's called an interstitial, a splash screen placed in front of it, et cetera. And the more tools like that you can put in the hands of individual users to reward their fellow participants for civil discourse, for productive discourse, and to help them, in effect, exercise their freedom of association to not engage with the trolls. All of that is beautiful. So yeah, very robust, properly functioning tools that you put in the hands of individual users. And that would be the way you handle anything except illegal speech. Of course, illegal speech has got to be removed. None of us wants to have our tools used in the commission of a crime.
What do we know about what kinds of I guess you called it engagement enhancing algorithms are used by a Twitter and by Facebook, and what do we expect? Would Elon Musk do anything about that? I mean, like, presumably it's part of the business model of a social network. So you're offering a kind of a different take that we can distinguish ourselves. We Parlor can distinguish ourselves by offering these tools like a trolling filter, right? What would it take for Musk to put that in place in the new Twitter?
So I think that, of course, he already has those things in place. So some of those things are already in place. What I think is the difference between Twitter and Parler is that on Twitter, sometimes based on the content of what you're sharing, sometimes based on whether what you're sharing is deemed to be hate speech or not, your content would be demoted in feeds and stuff. And this is not happening on Parler. The only way that your content is not going to appear in people's feeds is if they choose to unfollow you or block you or mute you or whatever. So, we leave it to individuals, whereas Twitter takes it upon itself to take actions on the content based on whether it, and based on content is the hugest thing. Because obviously on Parler, we don't do anything with respect to so-called misinformation, disinformation, et cetera. And I think that's really one of the reasons that we were deemed to be, dangerous to a certain extent. You hear people, I actually heard it in the last couple of days, someone was trying to say that the biggest killer of Americans or humans or whatever is disinformation. When it gets to the point where we're not allowing for the fact that human beings have free will, they have the ability to decide whether they believe something or not and whether to take action upon that belief, then where are we as a human race, right? So at Parler, we say, no, we expect you to think for yourself and, you curate for yourself what you see in your own feed. In terms of the algorithms, the actual algorithms, I don't know. I've heard them described, obviously, in these documentaries, just like you probably have, that they will promote content in people's feeds based on how much engagement it either has gotten or they expect it to get from the particular people who will see it. And that those sorts of algorithms, I think, really are, like I said, the culprit. What's the solution? The solution would be to be transparent about them at least, or perhaps remove them. And so I think that's what Musk plans to do. I know that the EU has just put forth an agreement to enact legislation, the specific wording of which hasn't been provided yet. And apparently, in the EU, there's going to be some government control over the algorithms, supervision over the algorithms. Right. And again, to me, that starts to push us towards the Orwellian universe in a way that feels uncomfortable. I'm all for transparency. I'm all for options. I'm all for the chronological feed. And again, I think Musk also plans to put controls in the hands of individual users. All of that sounds good, but I'm wary about government oversight even and what that looks like concretely.
Bruce Wolf, one of our regular viewers, asks, could you compare this to Reddit and what you've just discussed at Parler to Reddit system?
I am embarrassed to say I haven't spent enough time on Reddit, and certainly I haven't had any issues with content moderation on Reddit in the little time that I've spent that I could tell you exactly what the difference is. But I think that they are somewhat similar to what we do. But we have a combination of sort of an AI through Hive. I don't know if you've heard of Hive as a well-known moderation service. We will send only the text content or images, without any personally identifiable information, to have it scanned through Hive's engines and to actually pre-screen out anything that is illegal, inciting, or violent. And they're quite good at that. In addition, they can flag NSFW images and put a splash over it. Those are allowed on Parler under freedom of expression. So we do that. We also have the ability for users to report content. We have appeals and reviews in a very transparent process that involves the Parler jury, which is composed of users and then reviewed by Parler employees. But it's all around the First Amendment. And the only things that are going to get you banned from Parler are going to be illegal speech or being a bot. Of course, we do, like everybody else, need to control bots and spam.
So probably just a few more minutes if anyone has questions to ask. I want to just come back to the Section 230 question. And early, that is in the last 3 years, as Section 230 has been kind of very much criticized, whereas it used to be, oh yeah, this is a great, important tool.
The chat, sorry.
early on, people were starting to focus on some of the transparency requirements. Like, let's put a rule. And I think this is one of the bills that has gotten traction I mean, it's not passed any chamber yet, but the notion that we're going to require a Facebook or a Twitter or social media company to disclose in some way something about the algorithm that's used, right? And this just raises so many questions that I don't know the answer to yet, but perhaps you have some thoughts on. And Jessica Deere of Ranking Digital Rights has just chimed in with the question: does Parlor publish a transparency report? So let's kind of give both those questions to you, Amy.
Yeah, so we have not published one of the reports like you see with Facebook. At this point, the traffic is low, the types of content, the percentage is extremely low of the types of content that is usually being discussed in those reports. If you go on to Parlor, you can actually see, in terms of, again, what many people call hate speech. If you see something that's covered by a splash screen that is either a clickable splash screen, which you'll see on the web, or on the apps where, for instance, the iOS and Google Play stores, they strictly prohibit the appearance of any of that speech, you'll see unclickable splashes in the apps from those stores. You'll see how infrequent even that kind of speech is, but there's a low amount, and there's not very much going on. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by more questions coming in now at the last second. So no, we don't have those reports. In terms of a requirement to publish those reports, of course, someone like a Facebook or a Twitter with more resources, bigger platforms, any regulation like that provides some sort of a reporting burden, other sorts of regulatory burdens are going to favor those platforms. So you're never surprised when you go on to LinkedIn and you'll see one of the ads from Facebook and it says, Facebook supports updated internet regulations. Well, of course they do, because all of the things that they've been doing to make government happy with them, reports that they've generated and all these processes and everything else that are very expensive that they can afford, we can't. If that's put into law, then that's a burden. Now, I think that transparency with respect to the algorithms is going to come out as a principle of law anyway, whether or not you amend Section 230. Because again, if you go back to what Clarence Thomas is calling for, and he's done it twice now, like I said, he's calling for the accountability to the platforms for what they've provided. And again, what they've provided in part in terms of contribution to the reach and the presentation of the content is these algorithms. So in a proper case before a proper judge, this is going to come out in court, I think.
Well, but we have the link here to the article, which we'll post on the Broadband Breakfast Live Online page. Before I get to a last question I've got for our guest, Amy, I want to remind you that next Wednesday, we're here every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time. Next Wednesday, and we haven't yet published this, it'll be on later today. We're going to have Joseph Wender, the director of U.S. Department of Treasury's Capital Projects Fund, which has got a very important role to play in broadband infrastructure. He will be our guest on Broadband Breakfast Live Online, and we hope many of you will join us for that. My last question for you, Amy, actually building off of Susan Meyer's question here. She says, it is refreshing to see a businesswoman attorney as a philosopher as well. As Ayn Rand wrote, businessmen need philosophy. Okay. And so, I'm sure we're both familiar with Ayn Rand's philosophies, and to put, she's often regarded as a libertarian, a kind of no government, free speech type of person. And yet, isn't free speech being threatened by the left and the right today? And I'm continually shocked with how many so-called conservatives, kind of in the Republican Party today, are willing to countenance very strict government measures against speech by a tech platform, for example. I'm just wondering, what is the future of free speech, and what is your kind of take about that value, that philosophical value in our day and age?
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for the boot up there. First of all, Rand did not think that there shouldn't be government, right? She thought that you should have a minimal government, police, courts, military to protect individual rights, which means freedom from initiation of force. She thought government was a necessary good. So just, that's how she's a bit different from all the libertarians. I like the idea of, businessmen need philosophy, because one thing that I would want to say is this businessman, this very successful businessman, Elon Musk, who very much wants to help preserve the future of free expression. And this is why he's doing it. I think everything he does, he's trying to improve what the future for the human race, right? There's a couple of philosophical nitpicks, and I would ask you to think about them. And on my Substack, which is don'tletitgo.substack.com, again, that's where I'm writing really more for me, not on behalf of Parlor. But there's two things that he's done recently that I would just ask him to think about some more. One is when he's talked about quantitative formulations of what free expression looks like. So he said things like, oh, I'll know I've succeeded in my policy. And I think he follows Lex Friedman on this a little bit. I know I've succeeded in my policy if I make 5% of liberals and 5% of conservatives unhappy. And of course, free speech is a principle. It's nothing that is quantitative. And I'm concerned if you're going to have that metric be the standard for whether or not you've implemented proper policy. The second thing that I get a little concerned about is when he puts out formulations that are positivistic. And by that, I mean that you say that whatever law is, we're just going to enforce it. And he's a number of times said that he wants the policy at Parlor to hew very close to the law, and that should be enough. And in United States today, that is pretty much enough. Now we have, like I say, these threats that are coming in from these alphabet agencies, and we need to watch those. But generally, the Supreme Court has been beautiful in upholding a robust right to free expression. They've been really getting this right. And so in the United States, hewing close to the law as what, a positivist that says law is law, we'll just accept what the law is, that's fine. But recently, someone from the EU came and met with Musk in Austin here and basically got him to give the sign off or nod on the broad conception of this recent EU legislation. And as I said, I think there are certain problems with that legislation that might increase the entanglement between government and big tech and push us towards a more Orwellian future, which I don't think Musk or any of us wants. So I would just caution anything that's quantitative in formulation about implementing policy and anything that's too positivistic. If you disagree with the law in a particular country, you can still offer your platform there while presenting conscientious objections to the way that they handle free expression. And that's what I am planning to do as we expand into foreign countries at Parlor.
Well, thank you for a very robust discussion on this topic. On behalf of our guest, Amy Peikoff, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time.